Ooh, good afternoon, everybody. Excuse for the volume, it was loud. Thank you so much for being here today for this open book session. My name is Ashanti Kunene, and I'm your hostess with the mostest for today's dialogue. And I welcome you with all the light and love and grace that I am. Our topic for discussion today is titled Feminist Imaginings, the Importance of Creativity as a Driver for Change and Tool for Resilience. With me today are three amazing women. I'm so excited to be sitting here. We have comrade mother Gertrude Fester, who has published her prison memoirs as I choose number 12 in the Yengeni trial, also known as the Rainbow Trial of 1987. What resonated with me in your story was your ability to create and be creative in the midst of so much violence and repression. We have feminist superwoman Pumla Gqola, who has just published Female Fear Factory and a much anticipated follow-up to a 2016 book called Rape, a South African Night, where every single page was to the patriarchy, okay, in this book. And then finally, we have Margie Orford, who has written the most incredible story called Eye of the Beholder, which left me feeling that as women, we can be dangerous agents of death if the men do not bust up, okay? So read together, all three of your books are searing insights into the machinations of patriarchal phallic power at the messy nexus of race, class, and desire. And it's also dealing with difficult things like shame, fear, control, silence, anger, the male gaze, what it does to a girl, to a woman, her ability to just be, and even our ability to show solidarity with one another. So thank you so much for being here. It is an absolute privilege and honor to hold space for you today. Before we begin, I just want to say to the audience that if at any point you feel uncomfortable during this conversation, know that that is okay. Know that that means I'm doing my job correctly. And I humbly request that as you listen to the conversation, to do some somatic tracking, see where in your body the uncomfortability shows up, because our feelings have physical sensations, and particularly for the men in the audience. If that uncomfortability drives you to want to have a conversation with the woman after this, please just make sure before you approach her that you've resolved for yourself why you are uncomfortable, so that we don't do that emotional labor for you, okay? And with that, we can start there. Now we can start. So the first question, and Margie, you can begin and we can go this way. Please tell us something about your impetus and the need to write your book, to be creative, to create. Why was telling your story important? What was the lesson that you were trying to impart to the reader? Because all three of your books illustrate how creating energy can dramatically disrupt the scripts of power in the world. So.
Well, The Eye of the Beholder started actually as the sixth one of my Claire Hart novels, it was called Teacher's Pet, so you can imagine what it was about. And I wanted to look at the production of pornography, especially pornographic images of children. Mm-hmm. So this is about feminist imaginings. And I found my Claire Hart character, some of you will know, she was a private investigator, a psychological profiler. And I wrote the whole book, and then I decided not to publish it because I felt the book in that form, this investigation into images, replicated the crime. Mm-hmm. And I pushed the thriller to the edge of what I could do as a feminist writer. I don't mind taking risks, but this one I thought, all I'm doing is replicating the gaze. Mm-hmm. So I put it aside, and then I thought, I have to tell the story. Mm-hmm. I have to tell the story of what images do to us. Mm-hmm. What images of the woman as an object. And I kept on thinking, what is that thing to be a thing? To be made into the thing by the gaze of another. And it took me really a long time to find the form, a book that's all about images in which I never show them to you. I show what it feels like to be objectified. And I think that the impetus really was from an investigative piece I did many years ago in which a young woman had been duped and then drugged into making this kind of pornographic film, which, as we know, we never get anything off the internet. I'm not giving you spoilers. This is not precisely what the thriller is about. So this was early 2000. So just at the evil dawn of revenge porn, of this pornographic gaze, which is the dark side of the internet. And she said to me, and I was patron of Rape Crisis then, so I worked a lot with survivors, and she said to me, it never stops. Even when I'm asleep, someone is watching that, and that crime is being done to me again. So my question was, which pertains to trauma, how we tell stories of trauma, what do we do with the crimes that never stop? Because often a prison sentence does not stop the crime. The experience that you were talking earlier about, keep track of bodies. I'm doing a goose flesh thing now. What happens with those crimes that never come to an end, and how do we end them? How do we bring some sort of closure so that we can move in? And the eye of the beholder, I think, is the first part of my answer.
It was phenomenal. It was amazing. Gave me so much power, that book.
Oh,
sure.
Good.
Yes.
Why I write? Well, firstly, there was never ever time to write. We were too busy fighting the struggle, point one. However, people would come and interview us from the north, just for like a few hours, and then go home and write books, and sometimes completely distorted. So my comrades said, "Gertrude, you must write our book, you must write our book." But I mean, there was never time. I mean, at 1 a.m. you're busy rolling off, I don't know if you remember Gestetner. That's there, for pamphlets at 5 a.m., so that was my life. So it was ironical that it was in solitary confinement, 24 hours a day with nothing to do, and to say, look, they're not going to get the better of me, when I composed my play in my head. The spirit will not be caged. So that was the play that I had, which I did at Beijing Women's Conference as part of a workshop, Women's Creative Way of Dealing with Trauma. However, then I became a member of parliament, and there were so many laws to repeal, new laws, and Domestic Violence Act, and all sorts of things, that there was never time. I was a commissioner on gender equality, I was advisor to Pumla, and then to Norma End. And then when I decided, no, because a book was published on UDF. Now, I think most of you know that UDF was launched right here in Cape Town. And who did the preparations? And people came from all over South Africa. And who did the logistics? Where did people sleep? What did people eat?
Ask the question.
Who organized it?
Ask the question.
So there are books written on the UDF. The author shall remain unnamed. With not an iota of the women's work. The UDF here had no office. Oh, sorry, my hands are all over. No, sorry. They used our office in Hare Street for 6 months. I don't even know whether they paid. So yes, that was it. So I was going to write that, and I used my play as a basis. But also I must also give credit to military veterans. They have the mandate to support and facilitate the documentation of struggles. So I had 3 chapters, the state of emergency, solitary confinement, the trial, and they gave us people from HSRC to assist and facilitate, and they said, why didn't you write a chapter on your childhood? What made you want to write? So I've got that chapter. And then, you must have the women's voices. So I've got that chapter. And then I had the privilege of teaching in Rwanda. I taught transitional justice, mainstreaming gender. And there I witnessed the reality of attempts at reconciliation, at attempts of forgiveness, of retribution, peace villages for women-headed households. I mean, there are challenges, of course. I'm not one to be romantic. So I decided, I must come home now and I must interview my main interrogator and torturer. So I, of course, tried to get hold of his number. I couldn't get hold of his number. But I did remember that he was on television with the MEC of Correctional Services, and they were always laughing. And when we were in interrogation, he said, he wants to work because he's done work on rape and he'd be in a new police station, police force. And I said, no, we first have to have a Nuremberg type of trial. He said, there were no human rights violations in South Africa. I said, what are you doing to me now?
What are you doing
You who stripped me You're never alone. They solitary confinement. When you go to the toilet, you have someone to go in with you. So, of course, after each interrogation, strip. I don't even wait for them to strip. I just strip and threw my clothes all over. So, yes, so then I eventually asked this comrade, SACP, former MEC, for the number. I was scared to phone. I was at Canal Walk, and I phoned, and I said, this is Gertrude. And you know what happened? He immediately started shouting at me, and I became a victim.
Again.
You tell people all things, wrong things about me. I said, I've never mentioned your name. And then I just regained my energy. So there's a chapter on Rwanda, and I have all his emails in as well in the appendix. Of why,
Give thanks.
why he was such a good police person to the National Party government, and why he's such a good person in the ANC government. And he's a general, so you can imagine his pension. So much for the TRC, yeah?
On that spicy note, Pumla.
First of all, can I just say Ashanti for President of the World with that, what was that opening?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. So why did I write Female Fear Factory? Is the question, right?
The impetus, just the whole thing together.
So I was never going to write Female Fear Factory because so in my head, and occasionally those people who are close friends of mine have to deal with this craziness. I have lists and lists of all the books I'm going to write before I die. Mm-hmm. But I realized, because I'm turning 50, that the list is insane. So occasionally they move around. Female Fear Factory was never going to, it doesn't appear anywhere on it. It still doesn't appear anywhere on it.
Because you wrote
But it appeared.
It's finished now.
I wrote a book, a small book that nobody's heard about, called Rape: A South African Nightmare. And in that book, there was a small thing that I was trying to use to explain something much more important. And I thought so I wrote a little chapter called The Female Fear Factory as part of explaining something. And even though I was happy for 100 people to read that book, there were some things I thought were, what was clever there? Oh, that was interesting. Female Fear Factory was not one of them, right? But this is the thing about writers. Sometimes you don't know what you're doing. Well, a lot of the time we don't know what we're doing, no matter what we tell you afterwards. But then I realized that what resonated the most, when in conversation, right? So normally I write a book because I write the book I want to write, because something bothers me and I'm obsessed with it, and then I just, or I write whatever things. I mean, most of what I write doesn't make it into books. But people wanted me to talk about rape, and everywhere I went, the most difficult questions, the most interesting conversations, people said, and now come talk to us about the Female Fear Factory. And I thought, I don't have anything else to say. It's all in the chapter. And then I was like, why don't you ask me to talk about this really clever thing that I came up with here in this chapter? And people were like, that's very nice. Can you talk to us about the Female Fear Factory? And they said, oh, you know what, the Female Fear Factory? And so it was conversations over several years of people, and also people kind of talking about it in really interesting ways. And then I thought, well, okay, so maybe so it actually was a very unusual process, because it came out of conversations around something that I thought was finished. So that's the answer.
The answer, yeah. I mean, the work is never done, right? So that's a beautiful segue into my second question around how do we uproot fear from within ourselves as women? And for men, how do they learn to break the silence around the fact that the monster rapist is not out there in the world, but he's here, kissing you, telling you he loves you, this devil, ne? And I asked this question also in the broader understanding that both patriarchy and racism are simultaneous projects of cognitive and embodied unlearning. And we learned this during Fees Must Fall, when there was a break in the leadership because the men still wanted to violate us after we put our bodies on the line to help them fight the white man. I remember quite clearly a sister comrade saying, we're not going to help you get the land back from the white man if we're going to come back and then rape us and kill us. We can rather all die and not get the land. What do you mean, So this thing around how do we uproot the fear and break the silence, particularly for men who know what's going on, but we pretend that there's nothing, so you can go.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, you can start.
Okay, so I think, firstly, we have to understand, first of all, we have to shift what we think fear is, right? Because I think that, certainly I was raised, or the time in the world when I was raised, we talked about fear as a private emotion, right? It's just like, it's a natural emotion. I remember several times people saying, but everybody feels fear. And so, and that's fine. But people meant things like, well, when you run to the edge of a cliff, most people are afraid. If you touch a hot thing, then if you see a spider, okay. Maybe I'm giving away a little bit much with the spider bit. But that it's a natural, automatic, healthy warning system. That may well be true, but I think it's also important to recognize that that there's certain public feelings, right? Shame, fear, care, hope. Yes, those are very intimate, private feelings, but they're also big public, political processes. And I think that it's dangerous to treat the intimate expression exactly the same as the public emotion, right? Because the public emotions tell us something about power in our societies. They tell us something about, and so we can't just avoid them. We can't just if I have enough courage and enough faith, I will just not feel any fear, which is often just go bungee jumping, girl, conquer the fear. That's great for that kind of fear.
Go bungee jumping with a spider.
Go bungee jumping with a spider. Let's close you into a little, we'll do shock therapy or whatever, I don't know. And so I think that it's important, part of the work we have to do against fear as a political process, as an organizational, historic thing that orders the world, is to first of all recognize that that's what it is. Right? And what I try to do in Female Fear Factory is, of course, I write about Female Fear Factory, but really I write against the Female Fear Factory, but I have to name it in order to write against it. Because it's not, we don't imagine it. We don't imagine the reasons for fear. And so it seems to me counterintuitive for us to just try to be less fearful and be heroic and courageous, right, when the thing is there. And so we need to undo the system and the structure of the thing. So we need to, that's why I write against the Female Fear Factory, because I think that's a small step in helping many, many, many other feminists in the world illustrate the thing as a system, right? And so I think that we have to fight it even as we feel the fear. I don't think we can unfeel the fear. And I think that expectation is a difficult one. Not your question, but just the
expectation. There were two parts, because the second part is, yes, as women we must overcome whatever the fear, but the men and their silence and their complicity in that, they are the thing that we are fearing. So,
yes, no, absolutely, because the fear is created. That's why I call it a factory, right? That's what was important for me, to illustrate that it's not just a thing that it's not the air. It's not the air. It's a constantly produced thing. So the reason there's fear is because something is generating the fear constantly, right? And so men, women, people of different genders, whoever's creating the fear, right? The fear. So I try to illustrate what the factory is, because the factory is a metaphor, what the factory is. And so the responsibility, of course, there is a sense of responsibility, as you correctly say, not just by those who feel the fear, who are the targets, and the kind of the forced fed, the consumers, but also by the people who are implicated in the production and who are active in its production, or who just claim not to be doing it, but benefit.
Can I just
Please
comment? I just wanted to respond to what you're saying so eloquently about this production of fear. And in your writing of this highly creative non-fiction, emotional, you really get thought feeling. We don't have a word for it in English, and I've been hunting in all languages for a thing that describes thought feeling, which you capture so well, of this creation of fear. When I've come to it as with non-fiction, what I've tried to do is, that phrase you said, it feels like air, it feels like air. And there's two things about air. We don't know when we're breathing in poisoned air, for one, but it seems absolutely natural. And one of the things that, for me, the gift of fiction and of storytelling has been, is that you get to the point of the origin of this thing that you've taken in, and then it inhabits the whole of you, as if it was always there, as if it's a kind of life-sustaining thing. Because one of the things about dealing with gender violence, when you're talking about men, is it's very obvious if someone comes running at you with a machete. It's like a spider, it's just like, stomp on him or run away or something. But it's that emotional thing that so many little girls learn from so young, to look down, make yourself less, don't make yourself, until you make yourself nothing. Be careful, be smaller, until you get to a vanishing point. And in fiction, you can do almost a genealogy, I think, of the origins of that, of like this crime that never ends, because it's, even in my novel, I've got specific events in my main characters' lives, but it comes from before. It comes from before, this split that women create with this patriarchal gaze. And there are some patriarchal women who can look at you like that. You internalize it, you can look at yourself as something that should always be less or not be there. And it's unpacking that imagination I found so difficult. Really difficult, because you're working out of nothing almost. There isn't a genealogy of women writers. Women have always written and told stories, but each generation, we were talking about this, they vanish. So where do they go? Where do they go in the public imaginary? It's been one of my
absolutely, and I
great
think
concerns.
Can I just say one sentence?
Please.
And I love I think you have a formulation, I know you have this formulation. I just like saying I think, and I realize I say it too much. When people say, I'm sorry, I always say I think. I'm like, no, you don't think you know.
You know, yes, Mama, yes.
There's a phrase you use, Margie, about that originary narrative, that initial learning, and you call it, I think this is what?
I know.
And exiling, it's that moment of exiling from the self that is part of kind of socialization into femininity, and it's usually that first clear illumination of the gaze that terrorizes, and the difficulty of kind of languaging it.
And I think the difficult thing about it is how it often comes in such an intimate way.
Oh, yeah.
It's somebody caressing you, telling you that they love you, but it doesn't feel like love.
Yeah. I want to share my personal experience. It was in Cambridge. My husband and I were traveling. We first beat me. It was such a shock that he started crying.
You first what?
When he first beat me.
Oh.
And I said, you don't ever do that again. And then we went back to Holland, because I was studying there. And it continued. And I just thought, no. I said, okay, you can go back to South Africa, I'll stay here. And he wouldn't leave. And then I came home, and I just decided, oh no. And I must say, and you were saying, how do we also assist and encourage other women? I must say, look, I had all these degrees, I had a job, everything. So yes, I could walk out. But the fear, he just made his eyes big. I would cringe. I would try to be invisible. And then being in solitary confinement with 7, and you know, it's actually interesting. The fact that they were white, the fact they were Afrikaner, the fact they were, I think, hand-picked rugby player types.
Like a boera.
All over me. I mean, I just wanted to be invisible.
Sure, sure.
And I remember just cringing on that chair until I found my power. And my power was to just say nothing. And I could see how angry they were getting. For 7.5 hours, I said nothing. And even later, months, 2, 3, 4 months, it's interesting how you can gain your power. And I realized whether I'm standing naked, whether there are 7, and then Mostert, whom people who are acquainted with Cape Town in the 1980s, Mostert came in and walked around me, and he was throwing up this gun. And he said, oh, you know, this gun can just go off any time. I just stood. Yeah. And he walked all around me. I just stood and watched him. And the fact that I had silence as my power, it just encouraged me. And the whole thing, the resilience that you don't even know you have, to be in that cell for 20, 30 days, you know, and then another 40 days, and they don't interrogate you. It is actually quite an amazing experience, and I think it's important to share with others that you do have this power. And yes, initially, when I just heard keys, I would just shrink. But it was just the whole thing of deep breathing and just taking over your whole, and then just feeling this fear going away and just standing there, you know. It is quite a marvelous experience.
Sure. Phew, I'm collapsed by this. I read that experience and I remember thinking to myself, wow, how profound. We've lived so many things. So there's been so many experiences that have happened. And I was saying to Comrade Mother Gertrude that why is it that I'm only learning about your stories now at this big age? Why is it that we're only now being able to hear the stories of women, right? Because we are taught the history. I know about all the big men, but where are the women? No? Which then leads me to my third question. And then we've got another 10 minutes if I'll open to the audience around feminist praxis, right? That encourages authentic solidarity with one another. If we're understanding that the global white supremacist capitalist system is the institutionalization of patriarchy, of hierarchies of life that determine who is human and who is not, who is rendered disposable in society and who not, the ease with which women are abandoned by men, systems, power, the whole thing, and how much more complex this gets when you're looking at it from the nexus of race, class, and desire, which then complicates how we're able to show solidarity amongst women, even though our experiences under patriarchy are the same. So what are the things and the aspects of feminist praxis that need to change, or the shifts in understanding that need to happen so that solidarity becomes an actual thing, like that's not hollow, like the word Ubuntu, unfortunately. You know, that when you hear it, you're not immediately thinking, oh, these people.
Well, I think that it's important for us to also learn from history. And as someone who's been in the women's political struggle, there have been lots of lessons. I mean, I was amazed that Olive Schreiner, with her book Women in Labour, inspired the British suffragette movement, and then also was part of forming the Women's Enfranchisement Association of the Union for votes. But then there was a big tension in the organization because the white women said that they should fight for their votes first. And then if they get their votes, then afterwards they can fight for black women. And Olive Schreiner, who was the founder member, said, oh no, I'm not part of this, and then left. And I can go through how the instance of women uniting and being cognizant of race, of class, also locality, rural, urban, you know. And in the Women's Charter, which is not very well known, of 1954, the preface emphasizes the fact, and also the African Women's Charter, emphasizes that we have to take cognizance of race, class, gender, locality, language, etc., And also in our organization, and I know that some women used to be very upset that our councils on a Sunday would be like 8 hours long, because we translated into isiXhosa, sometimes Sotho and Afrikaans, because it was important for us that everyone in the room should understand. And I think the Women's National Coalition also is an important, I think it's a strategic example. The first, with the discussions around the coming negotiations, the ANC met with the National Party. There were 2 women present, Ruth Mampati and Cheryl Carolus. And we said, now what is that going to mean, that there are 2 women? So we decided that we are going to actually have a strategic alliance, even with women that we do not agree in many aspects. So we approached the National Party women. Yeah. We approached the DA women. We approached professional women's organization. We differed in many cases. The only thing we wanted in common was we must ensure that whatever comes out of that constitutional talks must take into cognizance gender, race, class, and location. And we also, I remember once dancing, and the Inkatha women said, gosh, here we are, women singing and dancing together, and our men outside are killing one another. So I think the important thing is that there must be strategic alliances, but cognizance of our differences. I mean, I am first generation urban. I come from slave and First Nation, but my family in rural Vinknesrivier, Kango Valley, District Oudtshoorn, their lives are exactly the same. So I have had, and I've also had the privilege of a feminist mother. Well, feminist in the sense that my dad died when I was very young. And all the patriarchs, I didn't know the word patriarchy at 12 years old, but anyway, all the patriarchs were around and saying, these girls must go to work. I think most people know that in black families, when the breadwinner dies, the children must go and work. And my mom said, all my children, all my girls will have professions, and I'll work my fingers to the bone. So thanks, Mom. Here am I, first person in my family with a degree going to university. So yes, I think we also owe our feminist mothers. I mean, of course, she would never say she was feminist, but the things that they did, they were hard, strong feminists. Yeah. So yes, strategic alliances. Also, there's sometimes, well, I must also emphasize, in the UDF, there was a lot of sexism, and we challenged it all the time. In the ANC, lots and lots. In Parliament, my first session until 99, I won't even go there. So these so-called progressive organizations, we must challenge the sexism and the patriarchy and the violence in it, but we need to be organized. Because what happens is that sometimes if you're not organized, you become a lone voice. That's true. So we need to be, and have these strategic alliances with other women.
Thank you. Margie?
Well, I've been, I suppose, a kind of lifelong feminist. I think I was born and I looked around me and I thought, oh, there's a fight.
That doesn't look right.
I know, it doesn't look right somehow, but the way that I work with feminist praxis and then writing, creative writing, are 2 different things. So I've been involved in women's politics in the 80s through when I was at UCT and various things, and then working with rape crisis for a long time, and then with PEN, the Freedom of Expression organization in South Africa and internationally. Because what has interested me, I mean, the politics Gertrude is talking about, obviously, the alliances, all of that, that's a bedrock, but there's something around narrative, which you've been talking about, Ashanti, which, why does this keep repeating? For thousands of years, women have been saying, excuse us, enough, let's change, it changes, it goes back. So with PEN, when I was on the board of PEN International, which is a coalition of free speech organizations in, I think, 170 countries, quite simple liberal idea of free speech as we have in our constitution. A few years ago, we drafted a women's manifesto, and one of the key things in the preamble there was that for most women, and your very moving story about your husband, I presume ex, assault on you, brought the so to home, is that the first boundary for most women is their husband's or their father's home.
Brothers, uncles, cousins.
Yes, and that is an internalized mental boundary in which it kills the imagination. Fear, as Pumla has shown us, diminishes the imagination. So I've done the feminist work I can in terms of politics in the world and in solidarity with various things. In my creative life, I spoke a little bit to the origin of this book. I think there's certain principles as feminists we need to think through in the storytelling that we inherit, the forms that we inherit, and those can be shifted around. And I wanted to tell you a very interesting little example, which is a new translation of the Odyssey, Homer's famous, one of the originary tales. A marvelous woman called Emily Wilson has translated, the first woman to translate this foundational text into English. And her feminist attention, so she doesn't shift what the Greeks said and did, but she shifts the gender relations and how words were translated, how words for enslaved women were translated, and the whole story shifts. So one of the ways of finding it for me in the praxis is, yes, there's one way of telling a story, but there are many ways of shifting the small details which illuminate something completely different. So our communication as writers, as fiction writers, is dynastic, and I will claim Homer. I will make him mine. I will use him, abuse him, and change him. So you were asking about what to do with the men. I think it's shifting this perspective word by subtle word until the water has eroded this patriarchal edifice completely, and it's like sand. And then we can make a castle out of it. But it's the same material. It's not different material. We just use it differently.
Sure.
Solidarity, imagination, praxis. I think in terms of solidarity, I think that I agree with Gertrude completely, that we have to remember that solidarity is worked at. Right? That it's even when we immediately feel solidarity, I think it's important to remember that solidarity is strategic and worked at and hard work. And I think sometimes as kind of contemporary feminists, when we look back to fantastic expressions and moments of solidarity, it's important, right? It's important to look back, it's important to look around us. But sometimes we don't think enough about the work that made the thing. That solidarity, even in our times, is constantly worked at. So I mean, I have had, I've been part of, and I've benefited enormously from feminist solidarity. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say in some of my work that feminism, being a feminist, and feminist solidarity has literally kept me alive sometimes, So it pains me a little bit when you talk about its hollowness. I'm not disagreeing. I get exactly what you mean. But I think it's important. Yeah, I like to remember also that it's not that maybe those moments of hollowness are a push for us to think about, okay, what work are we not doing to create it in this moment?
Ma'am.
So thank you so much for that. And then just quickly, when Gertrude was talking about the Women's National Coalition, of course she was one of the women that made it, right? I remember in my 20s, which really is a lifetime ago, when I was a postgrad at UCT, going to a few of those women's National Coalition meetings. And I remember the first one we all went, like a women's forum, and Sasko joined us, and we all went like, great, we're going to this off-campus big feminist thing, it's going to be so cool, we're going to be... And I remember the first meeting, and I liked this story, even though it was like, oh God, what have they done? What are the Gertrudes and
No, my Indians.
and what are they all doing?
Probably no great town, no.
And because but it was a very important lesson. The fact that, at 49, I'm remembering it, even though it happened at 20, whatever. It was at Salt River House, and a community house at Salt River. And there were all of these, there was a panel at there were different things that happened, but there was a panel, and I remember the woman, one of the women from the National Party, no, it wasn't called was it called the National? Yes, the National Party, saying, so there'd been some agreement about some interesting thing, and then it was all well and good that things had been agreed on and how people were going to pressure different organizations, but she was a little irritated, and then people were not listening to her, so she got increasingly enraged. And the thing that pissed her off the most was the use of the word comrade. She kept saying, no, I will not be called comrade. Comrade is a thing that communist men call each other. And enormous, really difficult work had been done. And I remember thinking as a younger woman, really, lady? Like, you've just done so many difficult things. I would have thought these are huge, insurmountable, ideological. But she was like, I will not. I don't care. Don't call me comrade. We cannot use this word comrade. We have to, because and that was an important. I mean, it's hilarious, right? But it was also like, yeah, sometimes the things you think are difficult. Like, there's difficult stuff everywhere, but the difficult things are everywhere. But you think, oh, that's the easiest part. We've agreed to apply this kind of pressure, to even gather as women, to even have this conversation. But the only thing you have a real problem with is this word comrade, right? So, and then I think imagination, sorry, I'm taking so long, I promise I'm going to be much shorter. In terms of imagination, I was put here, I was a child when I first realized I was a writer. Mm-hmm. So, and it wasn't a difficult thing to realize because of how it was presented to me, affirmed for me, and also because it's someone who loved books and so on. The other thing that also came to me that I've known since I was a child is that I'm a teacher. And then I learned other things about myself, and I called myself a feminist at 15 for the first time, even though I was a feminist before that. I just heard the name for the first time at 15 and recognized it as something that described me. And so in terms of praxis, I think that in those two spaces, as well as all the other things that are important to me, relationally, it's a constant attempt to think about what it means to live and to do a feminist life constantly. And so every single consideration in almost 30 years of teaching of what to do in the class. I mean, I don't always get it right because, sometimes I'm moody, sometimes I'm premenstrual, sometimes I'm just haven't slept or haven't had enough coffee yet. But it's so the praxis, for me, the praxis, I mean, it sounds very airy-fairy, but it's true. I'm constantly thinking about not just the big ideas of feminism. I'm constantly thinking about what it means. So I agonize about, and I probably over-agonize, about every word and how to write it and how to teach this particular thing and because I'm thinking, okay, fine, so the message is feminist, but is the praxis feminist? What does it mean? Is it feminist in the kinds of ways that I want it to be feminist? And that's why it takes so long to write. And I mean, or at least to make my work public. And people say, but you write so many things. And I'm like, well, actually, I write 500 times more. It's just, you're never going to see it because I'm just thinking, the argument is great, but are you writing against it? Because if I'm just, for example, showing you the female fear factory, for me, I don't think
that's useful.
I think it's important. I think the illustration and the naming is part of feminist work, but I am not satisfied until I feel like I have illustrated it in a way that helps us unmake it. That that I is a writing against, because the praxis is integral for me to to the politics, to the writing, to the teaching. And so sometimes, I mean, there's always a leaking of meanings. As Habiba Badarun tells, there's always a leaking of meanings. But I mean, a leaking is great. I love leakings. I love girls. I love women. I like leakings. Leakings are a good thing. But but you just kind of have to, you kind of have to do something with leakings.
Have to find it. Yeah, sure. Please.
You asked about the problem of men. So we could shift. It's always been the woman problem if we talk about what to do with men, because
or what they must do, because we're always having these conversations.
What they must do. Let's think about what they must do, because in many ways, just thinking of what Gertrude was talking about, this talk of this struggle, 99% of us end up being sellouts because we live with men, we related to them, we have sons, nephews, we love them, etc. And I've always thought my books were all about women. But I actually realized what I've been writing, and is about men, and masculinity perhaps would be a better way, because I don't think women are determined to behave a certain way, and I don't think men are. And I think one of the most useful things for me in my feminist thinking has been intersectional feminism and ideas of gender fluidity and the kind of complicating of the somatic experience, if I can put it in fancy language, but making the body uncertain has been important. But in my long experience of writing fiction and non-fiction, one thing I realized is that it was the shamelessness of perpetrators. And I was thinking, in the economy, where did that shame go? It's not possible. So they would insert the sort of old VHS of shame into a woman, into a body more vulnerable than theirs, who would then play out their shame, carry their shame. So one of the things, I remember saying to someone, just push that VHS. Those of you who remember VHS, they're so annoying. You put it in the machine, it goes out. Push it in, just do that. But over and over and over, say, take your horrible tape and
I'm not responsible for your emotions, you are.
Yeah, it's not even my tape, it's your tape, take it. But there's something crucial if we are to stop this violence, if men are to stop this violence and not. And the truth is that men have to give up a lot. They do not liberate themselves by becoming nice. They give up a lot of privilege, a lot of entitlement. Like white people in South Africa, they give up the land and wealth. It's giving up a lot. It's not, hopefully they'll feel better from doing it, but it's a complicated thing. But for men especially have to be able to, I really think the origin of so much of this aggression is an inability to fit into masculinity, a vulnerability, that they were babies once, that they were entirely dependent, that they still are, that they will get old and weak. And this performance, this carapace of strength and hardness is something that harms us, but it's taking their VHS shame tape and just playing it themselves, and they'll find out it's not that bad.
Reflect for yourself. Go to what I said at the beginning, just for yourself. Exactly. Go see what's going on before you come talk to us.
Because feminism for me is so much what you were talking about, Gertrude, about being naked and powerful. Total, you can't deny the vulnerability, but there you are in all your strength and yourself and your exactitude. And I think, to me, that's what feminism is a fitting together of power and acknowledgement of vulnerability. And then the solidarity, obviously, and the strategic alliances.
Okay. In the last, as closing thoughts, because I had one more question that we must open for the audience. In lieu of the intergenerational conversation we're having today, what is the content of the baton that you're handing over to the young people who have all the creative energy and still have years to go? What is the content? Closing thoughts, then we'll open to the audience.
I'm noting the time, so just to be brief, I think the important thing for me is intergenerational dialogue. And when I'm invited often to a panel, I say, okay, I'm bringing a young woman along so that we can share. I think we can learn, we can share, we have different needs, we have different understandings, but that dialogue is important. In fact, I even took one young woman with me. I was invited to Bellagio. I don't think many of you know the Rockefeller Center where you can sit and write on the shores of Lake Como. And so I said, no, in South Africa we have intergenerational dialogue. I have to bring a young woman along. And then I brought a young woman along, and together we wrote our chapter. So I do think that's, and I'll stop here because I think there's the time.
So I think that it's care, a reminder in both directions. Because I think there's a lot of intergenerational dialogue. But there's a lot of, I think, a reminder to both younger feminists and older feminists and different generations of feminists that of the responsibility of a feminist ethics and a feminist care. Because I think older people are like often, let's tell you. And then younger people, and it's
You can't tell us.
patronizing, and the younger people are like, responding obviously to like being treated like they're children by parents the way children do, and saying, oh hell no, break, we're not, and then it's not really dialogue, and then we call it intergenerational dialogue all the time, but it's not. It's just old people going on and running on about they know everything, and the young feminists going, oh hell no, you don't know anything, we don't care, we're not paying any attention, and it's I think it's that just that kind of, is it dialogue because we actually care about the thing, and there's a long complicated history
and
of thinking about how to talk, the feminist in the dialogue. What is the feminist in the fabric, in the words, in the sounds, in the notes of the dialogue from both ends?
Thank you, Margie.
I think in my baton will be two things. Very sharp knife,
I love it.
in case she needs it, a stiletto, and a scroll of blank paper so that my daughter's metaphorical and literal can use that sharp knife to dip it in the ink and write to me or write to their own daughters, but tell their own stories, because each one is the same and each one shifts. So the pen that can be both sword and...
I love it. Thank you.
Queen of South African crime fiction.
With that, I want to open up for questions. We're going to take them one at a time. I think we maybe have time for 4 questions. Who's brave? Who has courage? Who wants to go first?
We're unarmed.
Okay, we're unarmed.
Where's your scalpel?
Yes, ma'am. Second ma'am.
Thank you. Margie, on Friday, I think it was, you said something about looking what justice would look like, which we clearly don't have for women in South Africa. And yet, thanks largely to women like Gertrude, we have one of the best constitutions in the world. And perhaps for me, I'm interested in, we've talked about what do women do, what do men do, what should men do, but what does our government, in the broadest term, do to shift things?
Were you asking me?
I'm asking anybody, sorry.
I think the government
in particular, because for me the irony is we do have one of the best constitutions in the world for women.
Governments generally, I mean, I live in the UK now, governments generally do nothing for women unless we twist them by something rather tender. So I think that one of the problems, what I've learned about the law, if I'll just give one example, rape historically under Roman law, which Roman Dutch law is the law here, was a crime against property. So I'm not going to elaborate what that means, but there's a great deal that needs to shift in our understanding of the language of the law, of who is human and who is not. You know, you have in England, like in here, beautiful blonde white girl disappears. It's a massive furor. She strikes a note. Her death is ghastly and tragic, but it strikes a sort of mythic note about who's lost. A young black woman disappears.
It's everyday.
There's very little press. So that's a responsibility of storytelling, both fictional and non-fictional, to make bodies matter and then to shift the law around in that. So I think it's very complicated, and to me it seems a disaster that we've got this perfect super ego of a constitution. But 300-400 years of the worst repression, apartheid, colonialism, and enslavement on top of that, in which most people were considered things to be used. Women, part of that, but that's the thing that needs to be done, and it's a slow shift, as we clearly see. I don't know.
Second question. Thanks, Margie.
Got another question already.
Over here, yeah.
My name's Diane, and I'm... hello, Gertrude. Lovely to see you. I work as a psychotherapist, but have also been very politically engaged all my life. And what fascinates me, and to some extent you've just answered it in a way, Margie, but perhaps the others have more to say, is how early that social interface is impressed on us, into us, with early woundings and scares, and how that fear factory is produced so early and used in power structures later to oppress us all. I'd love you to each, or whoever would like to, respond to that. Thank you.
Well, shall I? Oh.
Fine.
Pumla, please go.
Okay, so in terms of Gertrude,
I'm 70.
I'm not scared of you. I've known you for too long. I think it does start very early. In one of the chapters in Female Fear Factory, the chapter on fluency, I look at a range of literature from this kind of huge study, different places, that traces the way in which, so I started with kind of a quotation that says, fear is expected of women, and then I follow, okay, so how does it get expected? And I look at a whole body of literature on that studies how parents respond to toddlers in play, and it was very instructive that even because I was trying to understand fear. Okay, it's easy, well, for me to conceptually to understand fear in relation to violence, but I was thinking, well, it doesn't just start there. So can we see how? And I look at this literature, and it looks at, because I was trying to say, well, we become fluent in the language of fear, but how? Like, if it's like language, how? And I find this enormous body of literature, which I spent quite some time in. I was delighted to find it, and horrified. I mean, I was delighted for the project of writing against fear, but I was horrified. Well, I mean, anyway, heartbroken. Because what it reveals is that even for toddlers, we all know little girls are fierce, right? But by the time we've become women, we're not as fierce. I mean, we have moments of fierceness, but little girls are perpetually surprising and unafraid and strange and daring and present. Mm-hmm. And so the literature shows that many parents, even the most well, I mean, of course, they're doing it from a place of love, but many parents, even in conditions of play, around playgrounds, all over the world, across very different societies, that girls are told to be careful. Yep. 10 times more on average than little boys for exactly the same things. And so then this lesson about be careful, doesn't really, and this idea that the world is fearful. So often boys are told, oh, sorry, my boy, go back, go try again. Mm. But girls, even when we say, okay, baby, go back, go try again, we say,
but be careful.
Just watch out, be careful, yeah. Just watch out, be careful. And so it predates even that first moment that we necessarily recognize as a fearful one, where someone treats you at 7 or 8 as though you are sexual, and there's that there's that self-exiling, and so I think it's important to think about those early moments and those moments that are teaching, that are part of the socialization of fear into femininity. As early as possible. So that was kind of my attempt at trying to do that. And then I know but they stole our time, so they should give us a little bit.
It's fine. They'll be fine. Yes.
I wanted to say that when we're also talking about, I think this conversation about, okay, what should men do is also really important. I'm a mother of boys, and I have nephews, and I think that very often when we have a conversation about women as parenting boys, it's a blame one. Well, it's your fault that the society is like this. And I'm much more interested in a conversation that says, okay, but what is the positive feminist parenting of boys look like at the level of vulnerability? You're taking into consideration those things that Margie is saying about how we locate vulnerability, how we locate what the socialization into a different masculinity is, rather than the kind of big one that we have. We're in a mess, but this country is a country of single women. It's all your fault then, women.
Motherless children, everything. Ooh, guys, we are 1 minute past 1 o'clock. I'll take this young man's last question, the youth, and then we can close.
It would be nice to have a young man to ask him a question.
Hi. How do we react to women who actively try to hurt other women?
Wow.
And how do we, because it's usually out of a place of like fear that men are going to try and other them, even though they think they are feminists, but they are hurting so many women, black women, trans women specifically. How do we react and try and make them understand what they're actually harming?
I like this question. How do we deal with patriarchal princesses and queens?
I wanted to say something. I had just spoken at a thing in Edinburgh with a woman called Joanne Harris, who has had a Twitter storm around her with very, very reactionary, I don't know what they call, I don't like to use that word turf because it's so misogynistic in itself, but women who are incredibly desperately anxious about sexual difference. And I've tried very hard to understand that position. It's an anxiety about the body which says, I'm female and it's so limited and it's so restricted. It's a completely impossible way to fight a feminist battle. And I say that as a white South African who got involved in women's politics in the 80s. It was such a destabilizing idea of what the body is. You had to find ways to transcend your own sense of your somatic completeness in order to at least get some empathy. At that time it was with black South African feminists. And I think for me that's the same thing. And it's a very dangerous form of politics, this exclusionary patriarchal women stuff, and it's invested in that same sort of fear, but I think its origins really is a vulnerability. Anybody who becomes aggressive about defending what they are, what their ground is, psychologically is a place of fear and anxiety. So therapy, perhaps.
I just wanted to respond very briefly. I think one of the key issues also is that many of us are in deep need of healing.
Oh, Mama.
And I think that many of us, I mean, when we started the gender advocacy program, we said, we must try and have 50% women. But we realized it's not, you can't just say 50% women, because those women may not even be women-centric, you know. It's an issue of concern, of care. And I mean, when I was in New York, McFadden said to me, you gender diva. So I said, yes, I'm a gender diva, but I'm accountable to women. I don't just trip from city to city. So yes, I mean, you have the feminist careerists. I mean, it was really quite disappointing. We had all these gender desks, and they just meant nothing, you know. So a lot of homework also to be done.
So homework.
But a lot of healing.
Healing.
And I think some of these very men, they are probably the people that really need. I think they haven't come to terms with their own vulnerability.
Can't they just go to Ireland and heal there properly all by themselves and then come back when we give them the passports?
No, I think we can expect better of men, right? I think we should and must expect better of them. So let them do the work, and we must also do the work. And on that note,
can I just say something? Sorry, one sentence. And I think that you, in one of your essays from a few years ago, you used this wonderful phrase. The illusion of freedom, to illustrate. Yes,
you've read my work. Oh, wow.
You say this wonderful thing, and I mean, okay, it sounds, just go and find the specific essay. I don't have time to explain to you what, like the things that I mean, but I'm just going to footnote it. Not footnote it, reference. So I think, speaking about men, there's a lot of work to do in thinking about the illusion of freedom, right? And I think that the way you don't just use it as a phrase, but like just the unwriting of, like you unmake the illusion. Yeah. And I think it's a beautiful argument, but it's a beautifully kind of performative piece. And I think, go read that essay and men can just do the performance of what she does in that.
I love it. Yeah. She says, please go read my article. Go read my work.
And then listen to that and watch not just the fantastic argument, but how she does the illusion. That's the thing, because I think the illusion of your own freedom and superiority and outsideness of things is the trap.
Yeah.
There you've got your intergenerational
Yeah, there we have it
feminism in
too.
action, where you've taught.
Oh, I'm so excited. We give thanks. Thank you all for being here.
The reference.